Good morning. My name is Travis Lamberti, and today I'll be exploring bias in applicant tracking systems, where it comes from, how it gets embedded in automated hiring tools, and whether we can engineer it out using data science and other techniques. This question matters because ATS systems now play a major role in determining who gets seen, ignored, and ultimately who gets access to opportunity. ATS systems screen millions of applicants every year. That scale means that any bias in these systems doesn't just affect one company, it affects entire labor markets. Research by Alberudi and colleagues shows that 85% of hiring discrimination falls into four categories: race, sex, age, and disability. In many cases, discrimination becomes embedded in the data that today's ATS systems are trained on. This is the topic of today's presentation, and by the end of it, I hope that you will leave with knowledge that will equip you to be a better data scientist, and engineer. We'll look at key terms, then we'll look at the four major types of biases in hiring. For each one, we'll examine two things: how the bias appears in human hiring decision-making, and how it shows up in applicant tracking systems. We'll look at some case studies and current research. After that, we'll look at mitigation strategies and challenges involved in reducing bias. The goal isn't just to understand where bias comes from, but also to understand what we can do about it. In conclusion, we'll attempt to answer the question, can bias be engineered out of ATS? Here are the key terms. Applicant tracking system is a software system that automates parts of the hiring workflow by ranking applicants and supports decision-making throughout the hiring process. A CV ranking system is a tool that scores or ranks an applicant's resumes. Human hiring is where decision-making is done primarily by a person, and algorithmic hiring is where it's done by an algorithm. Blind hiring is a recruitment approach that hides personal identifiers. When we look at race bias in hiring, the evidence is overwhelming across decades of research. Morehouse and Banahi discuss a series of resume audit studies that reveal how persistent these disparities are. In one of the most well-known findings, resumes with white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than identical resumes with black-sounding names. The applicants both had the same experience, education level, and skill, only the name was different. Another study found that black applicants were half as likely to receive callbacks as white applicants, even when actors were trained to respond identically in the interviews. One of the most striking comparisons is black applicants were just as likely to receive a callback as white applicants with a felony record. This analysis covered 25 years of hiring data from 1989 to 2015, showing race was stable over this entire period. Race bias is real, deeply embedded in the hiring process. By using data to train ATS tools without bias mitigation, we would be consenting to a status quo of discrimination. Song and colleagues show racial disparities and authorship patterns, which is important because it demonstrates how structural inequalities appear in data. Implicit racial bias also carries into automated systems. If a model is trained on decisions influenced by implicit bias, it will reproduce those patterns even if race is never explicitly included as a feature. The study shows that race bias in author acceptance rates was embedded in the data. Race was determined by the algorithm by using the author's name. Sex bias in human hiring is also well documented. Pathig and Kronig study shows that gender stigma influences evaluation in subtle but powerful ways. One of their most interesting findings is the outgroup evaluator effect. When people are evaluated by someone of the opposite sex, they often prefer to be evaluated by the algorithm instead of a human. This tells us two things. First, that people are aware of gender bias in human evaluation. And second, that they sometimes trust algorithms more, even though algorithms often learn from the same biased human decisions. This study gives us a clear picture of how gender bias operates even before we introduce ATS systems. The Amazon recruiting tool is one of the most widely cited examples of algorithmic gender bias. Fabrice and colleagues describe how the model learned from 10 years of historical hiring data that reflected a male-dominated tech workforce. Liu and colleagues showed that even when explicit gender markers were removed, the model inferred gender through proxies, things like women's colleges, women's sports leagues, and even extracurricular markers. Hauser explains that Amazon attempted to retrain the model and remove gender-related features, but the bias persisted. Eventually, the tool was abandoned in 2014. This case has become a well-documented warning for the entire industry. If you train ATS systems on biased data, the system will reproduce and even amplify those biases. Age bias in hiring is widespread and surprisingly invisible. Steinhoff points out that in the University of Michigan's National Poll on Healthy Aging, 93.4% of adults aged 50 to 80 reported experiencing regular ageism. In a global study of 6,000 employers, more than half did not include age in their diversity and inclusion policies, which means age bias isn't even being tracked or addressed in a significant number of organizations. From the applicant perspective, 45% of older job seekers reports that age discrimination was the primary barrier to finding a new job. Together, these findings show that ageism is not only common, but also structurally embedded in the hiring practice. And because ATS systems learn from historical hiring data, these patterns become part of the ATS model unless we actively intervene when building the algorithms. Kleinberg and College show that even when age is not included as a feature, models can infer it through proxy variables. Things like employment gaps, dates on degrees, job entries can reveal an applicant's age indirectly. Long employment histories and periods in the same role spanning 10 to 15 years can indicate an older applicant. Even listing proficiencies in older software tools can serve as an age proxy. Like age bias, disability bias is less studied in ATS systems, but evidence we have is concerning. TILM shows that non-standard resume formats, such as simplified layouts, screen reader formatting, larger fonts, or increased spacing, are often penalized by ATS systems. These formats are accessibility accommodations, but the model interprets them as deviations from the norm. Jones also reports that recruiters are 26 less likely to hire applicants who disclose a disability. Goodman and colleagues found that many applicants with disabilities chose not to disclose their disability because of stigma and fear of discrimination. Even when applicants do not disclose a disability, ATS systems often refer indirectly through patterns like employment gaps, part-time work, or involvement in disability-related organizations. Now that we've looked at the biases, it's important to understand how ATS systems learn these patterns. Fabrice and colleagues explain that ATS systems learn from historical hiring data. If that data reflects biased human decisions, the model will infer those patterns. Kleinberg and colleagues describe this as a pipeline. Human bias leads to biased data. Biased data leads to biased models, and biased models will result with biased outcomes. Even when protected attributes are removed, proxy variables such as zip code, college attended, employment gaps, and other certain keywords can reintroduce those attributes indirectly. Liu and colleagues show that modern models are extremely good at reconstructing missing demographic information. That means simply removing the protected attributes is not enough. The model can still infer them with high accuracy. Understanding this mechanism is essential because it explains why bias persists when engineers try to remove it. Now that we've seen how bias appears in human hiring and how ATS systems can inherit it and amplify those patterns, we must ask ourselves, why does mitigation matter? The answer is scale. When a human hiring manager is biased, that bias affects a handful of applicants. When an ATS system is biased, the technology can scale up, essentially giving it the ability to affect millions of applicants. At this scale, mitigation isn't just a technical concern, it's a fairness, ethical, and legal concern as well. One of the most straightforward mitigation strategies is blind hiring. This approach removes demographic signals like names, dates, and other identifying information from resumes before they're screened. Research by Alberati and colleagues shows this blind hiring can significantly reduce bias in early screening stages. It forces both humans and algorithms to focus on skills and experience rather than demographic cues and personal information. We see a similar effect in academic publishing. Song and colleagues describe how mass peer review reduces disparities in authorships outcomes by hiding the identity of the author. The same principle applies in hiring. When evaluators can't see demographic information, bias decreases. Fabriz and colleagues describe the categories of engineering techniques designed to reduce bias in algorithmic systems through fairness engineering. Fairness engineering includes pre-processing, focuses on debiasing the data before training. This might involve rebalancing datasets, removing problem features, or correcting historical disparities. In-processing involves modifying the model itself using fairness-aware machine learning techniques that constrain the model to treat groups more equitably. Post-processing adjusts the model's outputs after training, correcting disparities in rankings or scores. Across all three stages, of course, human-in-the-loop oversight remains essential. Engineers, domain experts, and stakeholders need to audit and review outputs, to ensure that fairness goals are being met. Kleinberg and colleagues make an important point about the difference between human and algorithmic decision making. Human decisions are ambiguous. It is often impossible for a legal system to determine whether a hiring manager discriminated because we can't see inside their reasoning processes. Algorithmic systems, on the other hand, can be audited. We can run controlled experiments, adjust parameters, and retrain the model if needed. This means that algorithmic bias is auditable, detectable, and correctable in ways that human bias is not. Human-in-the-loop oversight remains essential, but audits give us a level of transparencies that human hiring simply can't. In conclusion, can bias be engineered out of applicant tracking systems? Unlike a hiring manager's internal reasoning, algorithmic decisions can be audited. We can measure disparities, test for fairness, and if found, retrain the models. Research shows that we have tools to detect and correct bias that simply don't exist in human hiring. Reducing bias requires three things, though. Firstly, a focus on the data through blind hiring, clean data cleaning, and careful feature selection. Secondly, a focus on engineering using pre-processing, in-processing, post-processing, and as well as human-in-the-loop oversight. Finally, we need a diverse set of engineers and inclusive stakeholders. Fairness is not just a technical problem. With a more diverse collaboration, we set ourselves to have a better understanding of what bias is and also how to approach it. Even with strong mitigation strategies, there will be challenges going forward. First, engineers must make a conscious decision to prioritize fairness. Bias doesn't go away on its own. It takes deliberate effort to identify, measure, and reduce it. Second, many of the mitigation techniques we've discussed are still underused in real hiring systems. The research exists, but the implementation must be forefront in engineering. Third, we're still discovering new things about bias in ATS. As models become more complex, new fairness concerns continue to emerge. The challenge going forward, but the tools and knowledge are improving. That gives us a path forward. Can engineering be used to untrain bias? The answer is yes. We may never be able to remove every bit of bias, but we can design systems that are more transparent, measurable, and correctable than human decision making alone. Engineers won't solve everything, but I believe that it can solve a lot. And in many cases, it can make hiring fairer than it has ever been. Thank you for your time and for watching my presentation.